As the head director in the recent documentary Under the Gun, I'll be giving some insight and reasoning into the way we investigated the extreme difficulty the ATF faces in recovering gun purchase records and the repercussion this has on the justice system. I'll also be explaining the systematic prejudice Chicago experiences in regard to gun violence and how we represented this in the documentary.
When a gun is recovered at a crime scene,
we begin in this clip with an establishing shot of a worker pushing a trolley overloaded with guns. This is paired with a voiceover stating, when a gun is recovered at a crime scene. We did this in order to convey to the audience the sheer number of gun crimes being committed across the country.
The first call police make is to the ATF. Using the serial number, the ATF's job is to track down who owns the gun.
Even so,
we then take the scene to the ATF offices, where the voiceover continues. Using the line, "The first call is to the police," was intended to make the audience bridge a connection between the efficiency of locating a gun record and the laws within the country. Next, we have an interview with an ATF agent, Charles Husner, who explains how no gun records are kept digitally. We introduce this fact at the same time as showing him being surrounded by boxes of gun purchase records. We did this again to show the difficulty behind the process, as none of this is kept digitally.
National Tracing Center receives over 1 million records per month. But
the statistic of the ATF receiving over 1 million requests per month is paired with multiple workers in the background. This represents the high demand for gun purchase records. During the interview with Husner, he states that the extreme amount of purchase records has become a safety issue at the ATF, which is ridiculous, as there is a risk of the floor collapsing due to the weight of the records. We asked him what the ATF did with the overflow of records, and he took us out the back of the building where there were 2 full shipping containers filled with records. We then included this in the documentary to again show the absurd number of gun crimes in the US and demand for them to be solved.
This might not be a big deal if it was 1989 when the ATF received under 3,000 trace requests.
We followed this up with a digital graphic showing the number of requests the ATF has received over the past 25 years. The value of each year is depicted in stacks of paper, which exponentially grows year by year. This again reinforces that the records are not digital, but instead are kept on paper. The stacks eventually consume the entire height of the screen, conveying the overwhelming number of reports. We then have some on-screen statistics. One of the more shocking ones being that 30% of traces done by the ATF will fail. We hope this created a sense of empathy for gun violence victims, as many of them will be left without closure. Notice how all scenes at the ATF were used in slow motion. We did this to represent how tedious and boring the job of sorting through ownership reports were. We used this topic of unsolved gun crime as a transition to the prevalent issue of Chicago, Illinois. We used establishing shots to introduce the audience to the new setting in Chicago. Whilst in Chicago, we approached a group called Purpose Over Pain, which is a support group of victims of gun violence. One of the parents whose son was a victim of gun violence outlines the death of her son. The clip of her saying, his case has still gone unsolved, is then directly followed up by a montage of other parents saying the same thing. We did this montage in order to show the ancient methods of the ATF, how the ancient methods of the ATF affect real people in real time, with many families never being given closure over the deaths of their loved ones. This causes the viewer to question, why is this happening and how is it being allowed? Which is perfectly what we want them to ask, as it is the core of our argument. Through constantly explaining how the current laws in the United States have been lobbied for by the NRA, we have in some sense created a common enemy for the viewer. We have done this as their views directly dispute what we feel is important in order for our country to spark change. In the interview we conducted with Father Michael Pleasure of the St. Sabrina Church, he draws comparison between the reactions of a shooting in richer areas versus those in Chicago. He states that people see it as just another night in Chicago. This is the type of attitudes we wanted to address in the documentary, as it shows that people become complacent of gun violence in certain areas, which is the exact opposite to the attitude that is needed in order for change to occur. It also outlines this systematic prejudice towards certain people that I mentioned earlier.
Another night in Chicago.
We pulled a headline article from the Chicago Tribune regarding the mass shooting of 82 people in South Chicago and overlaid it with the audio of people screaming and asking for help. This was intended to show the audience how life-changing a gun crime can be. Actuality footage is then used showing people crawling on the floor in order to avoid being shot. This shows that innocent civilians can get caught up in gun violence, disputing that only gang members get caught up in gun violence. In Chicago, that is. We then followed this up with another news article addressing the murder of a 6-year-old boy by his 3-year-old brother. We used these two clips in order to dismantle the argument that only gang-related crimes exist in Chicago. We did this to show that the system is the problem, not the people. The next scene takes place in a historic church, a place of peace, which is completely juxtaposed to the horrific archival footage shown before. We used an establishing shot to introduce the audience to the new scene. We asked our interviewer to ask the Purpose of Pain group how they feel about the lack of attention to gun violence in Chicago in comparison to other states, and see how they felt about the complacency on the topic. We paired this voiceover with images of badges worn by the family members, containing photos of their late children, to again remind the audience that these are innocent people being killed. One of the parents, Tom Bosley, stated how he felt there is no sense of urgency in Chicago when it comes to gun violence. He explained there is a lack of grief counseling and resources in the state. This gives the audience a first-hand account of how the situation is going on in Chicago and how there is not enough being done about it. We chose a slow-motion clip of African-American children playing basketball and smiling, being kids, and a voiceover expressing the preconceived negative ideas of African-American children. We did this in order to show the clear disconnect between how people view youth in Chicago versus how they actually are. We then cut back to the footage from the interview with the members of Purpose Over Pain, where Annette Holt explains how her son was never involved in gang violence and was a law-abiding citizen. This is followed by all other members nodding their head in agreement. We ended the scene with one of the mothers stating that all kids in Chicago are not bad, reinforcing to the audience that the idea of all kids in Chicago being gang members is only used to dehumanize them.